Okay, so today we are going to start on your first watercolor painting. If you did not do yesterday's assignment, do that one first because that's kind of the overview and practice. So this is what we did yesterday. If you're in class, you're starting on a new piece of paper. If you're at home, you are continuing to use that same piece of paper you did your practice on. So we're still not going to use the whole piece of paper. So pretty much just going to cut in half the rest of the paper. Okay, so the picture we are doing is on your canvas page. So we are first going to start with the sky, which is a very, very, very faint blue. So remember, with watercolor, it is mostly water, very little paint. So I'm wetting my brush, I'm wetting the paint. I'm going to use this dark blue. I mean, this blue is light, kind of like the sky, but it's kind of a less natural shade of blue. Okay, so if it ever starts to feel dry, or if you're like, ooh, that's too dark, get some water on your brush and just paint right over it. Now, try not to like aggressively rub the paper with your brush because that can cause the paper to tear if you do too much water and do that too aggressively. So I'm just going in a side-to-side motion. I'm going to get a little more paint on my brush. So the sky is a very, very light blue, so you don't need a lot of paint. Mostly water, very little paint. I'm just trying to smooth it all out. Just pay attention to how many times I dip into the water. And I've dipped into the water several times, and I've only dipped into the paint a couple times. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the sky. For the water part down here, it's pretty much the same shade as the sky, just maybe a little bit darker. And then there's some reflections of the trees, which we'll do in a little bit. So even though there's trees overlapping some parts, I'm just going to paint all the water in, and then we're going to paint the trees over it. Again, it should not be like a solid shade of blue. There's a lot of white areas. You really should not be using a lot of blue paint. Okay, I'm gonna let that dry just for like a minute or so. Okay, so now I'm gonna start on the trees in the background right here. So I'm gonna start with the land that they're on, which is a pretty dark shade of green, so I'm gonna use the darkest one here. And I'm probably gonna have to mix some colors. So you can mix right on the paper, or you can mix like at the top of your tray. So I'm gonna put some of this green paint up here. And I'm gonna put some brown in it. And that just gives me a more natural shade of green. So these trees are about halfway up the paper. So make sure your background is dry before you do this, because then it's all gonna bleed together and make a big mess. Mine's not quite dry. Okay, and then we have some of the tree reflection on the water. So I'm just going to take that green and kind of do like a back and forth motion in the shape of these trees. Okay, so now I'm going to do some of the actual trees. I'm going to start with the ones in the background. So the orange ones. So I'm just kind of going in like a zigzagging back and forth motion. If your trees are not shaped exactly like the picture, it's not a big deal. I'm going to make this one a little bit darker, so I'm going to use a little bit less water. And now we have kind of a purplish color tree. These trees in the background, since they're further away than the trees in the picture that are very close to the front, are lighter. That tends to be the case with nature. Things that are further away are lighter. Things that are closer, darker and more in focus. Okay. I'm gonna let that dry a little bit. You can tell that it's still kind of shiny, so it means that it's still wet. And if I try and put something on top of it right now, it'll all bleed together. So I'm just gonna pause this, let it dry for a second. Okay, so now I need a pretty dark green. So I'm gonna use this green that I mixed before with the brown. I'm gonna get a little bit more paint in there. I'm going to try not to have my brush too wet so I can get it a little bit darker. I'm using the very point of my brush. And then these, I guess you can't see it. The other trees are very, very dark, so I'm going to put some black into this to make it darker. Dry my brush off a little bit so it doesn't bleed into the other colors too much. So if you notice your stuff is very wet and you're about to like paint on top of it, just wait until it's dry. If you just blow on it a little bit, maybe jump to another spot that's not quite as wet and paint there. But mine's still pretty wet, so I'm not going to put some of those trees in there just yet. Okay, so I'm going to let this dry a little bit and I'm going to move on to the trees over here. So I'm going to start with the orange in the background and the purple in the background like before. So this is a little bit, so I look at like the top of the trees. So the top of this tree is up here. The top of this tree is a little bit lower. So it's not like on the same, I guess what I would call horizon line as the other tree. It's going to make it look like it's closer than the other one if you put it a little bit lower. Okay, so that's a little bit dark, so I'm going to rinse off my brush and just get some water and kind of blend that out. Okay, now I'm going to do some purple. See, I had a little bit too much water on my brush and then it kind of bled a little bit. So I'm trying not to touch this other tree because I know it's going to all bleed together if I do. gonna do a lighter green, so I'm gonna do some green with a little bit of brown. And some purple in the reflection. Okay, then I'm gonna put some darker trees in the front, so I'm gonna use that green and black that I mixed. Again, make sure the trees in the background are pretty much dry, otherwise everything's gonna bleed together and make a big mess. I'm kind of going off of the picture now. Oh. Okay, now I'm going to work on the trees in the front, so they're darker because they're closer, and they're much larger because they're closer. So I'm going to take some more of my green, take some black, and these are pretty dark, so I'm going to use quite a bit of black. They're honestly practically black in the picture. So basically black, which is like maybe a little hint of green. So I like to look at where stuff is placed, so like this tree comes almost above halfway up the paper. And I'm just doing kind of random zigzaggy squiggles all the way down. This one's taller than the other tree. Not quite as dark as I want it, so I'm going to go back over it a little bit. I'm just doing all the trees that are the same shade of green right now. I'll do the lighter trees in a minute. Okay, so that's good for the darker trees. Now I'm going to do the lighter green. So just some of this green with a little bit of brown. And for example, tomorrow, like once this paint dries right here, you can still re-wet it and reuse it. Or you can just, carefully get like a wet paper towel and wipe it up if you want to mix new colors up here. Or you can just get like a paper plate or something. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to this green. Oops, it's a little too wet. Okay, so now I'm just going to go back in, maybe darken a few areas, add a few colors in. So there's some purple reflection in this area, so I'm going to take a little bit of purple. And I just cleaned my brush off, and now I just have some water on there, so I'm going to smooth it out. If you ever end up with too much water, you can always take a paper towel and dab your paper off. I'm going to take just some straight black and darken in some areas. There are little splotches in the picture. They just kind of flicked paint on their paper. I'm not going to do that because I don't want to make a mess. And there's little white specks on the picture too. You can do that if you want. I'm just going to leave that out. But for right now, this looks good enough. Alright, and that's it for this picture. When you're done with it, take a picture of it, submit it in your lesson. Tomorrow we will start something new. All of these are due Friday at midnight.